Hello, everyone. I decided to change things up a bit and talk about films made before the 1980s. So today I'm going to share my favorite film from every year of the 1960s. That was a great decade for cinema, way before I was born. But before I continue, feel free to share your favorite films from every year of the 60s. Starting at 1960 would be Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. I absolutely love this film. You know, it's after Peeping Tom, but it's still an iconic slasher in the genre. Stars Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates. You have Janet Leigh. Oh man, I love the story here. It really takes a swing. You think you know where it's going, and then it throws a curveball with that iconic shower scene. And this was a film that was very much ahead of its time and a crazy psychological thriller, to say the least, based on a novel. This is an absolute classic. The way Hitchcock shoots film is like seeing a painting come to life. You could tell that he sees it in his head and presents us with what he sees. After that, in 1961, is The Hustler. That's right, Fast Eddie, played by Paul Newman. This has Jackie Gleason. This is the prelude to The Color of Money, and I love this based on the novel. And I like seeing Paul Newman play this character of Fast Eddie, who is pretty arrogant. He's full of himself. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks he's on top of the world until he basically flies too close to the sun and learns the hard way. And I love that here. It's a really good, underrated story. I really felt like he should have got an award for this, but he at least got it for Color of Money. This is an underrated Paul Newman film, and both films are excellent. You can check out my review of The Hustler from years before. This is a 1960s classic. Next up in 1962 is the classic film Lawrence of Arabia, starring Peter O'Toole. Also has Alec Guinness and Anthony Quinn. I love this. This is actually based on a true story of T.E. Lawrence, who successfully united and led Arab tribes to fight against the Turks. This is a masterclass of a film with the cinematography, the editing, that epic match shot. You can see that recreated in John Wick 4. Man, the acting. Peter O'Toole's another actor who is underrated. It's a shame he never got an Oscar for this because, like, this movie is one of the greatest of all time. I absolutely love this. You wouldn't have Uncharted 3 without the story of T.E. Lawrence or even this film. So it's great to see that presented here, and I miss epics. We're going to get one with Gladiator 2 soon, but man, this is just good old-fashioned filmmaking at its finest. Next up is an underrated James Garner film called Move Over Darling. Also stars Doris Day. I love this comedy. This is one I watch with my mom all the time. We watched it on Turner Classic Movies. This is a very underrated film. Originally, it was going to be meant for Marilyn Monroe before she passed away. It stars Doris Day. She's this woman who's a wife of James Garner. She pretty much is on a trip and then is lost at sea. And she meets this guy and kind of falls in love with him at the island. And James Garner thinks his wife is dead. So Doris Day returns and she finds out her husband, who's played by James Garner, is getting remarried. And there is a whole slew of comedy and shenanigans there. A court trial, just everything. This is a really funny, feel-good movie, and it's unique, you know. It's a very different lighthearted affair compared to some of the other dark, more serious 60s films. And I love it because you still kind of had the lighthearted earnestness of the 50s, but then you're kind of getting more into the counterculture stuff in the later part of the decade. So this is a nice balance of the 50s and 60s at an early point of the decade still. Next up at 1964 is Goldfinger. This is a Bond film to change everything. Without this, you wouldn't have the 007 franchise as strong as it is now. You wouldn't have the spy genre. You had From Russia with Love and Dr. No, but this is a one to finally get the formula right. Sean Connery as iconic as Bond. Shocking. Positively shocking. Do you expect me to talk, Goldfinger? No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. That famous laser scene, Odd Job, or at Goldfinger. There's just so much in this. The whole Fort Knox sequence, Pussy Galore. That's right, the actress who is in the original Avengers TV show back in the 60s. I love this. This has the gadgets, the women, the story, the one-liners. This has everything you want from a 007 venture. And this is such a great film. And yeah, there's three B's that define the 60s. Beatles, Batman, and Bond. Next up in 1965, I actually have two films I really love that are tied. This was very hard. The first being a James Stewart film called Shenandoah. This is a film I saw in elementary, and it's actually quite similar. Should I say The Patriot is quite similar to this film. The Patriot with Mel Gibson is almost like this film, but set in the American Revolution. This one involves a Virginia farmer, and it's during the Civil War. He doesn't want to be involved. He's neutral, and a group of Union soldiers kill his youngest son, and that puts him on a war path. It's pretty much The Patriot, but in the Civil War. But you get James Stewart, who's iconic. I love James Stewart. This is an underrated Western slash war film slash revenge film. And if you haven't seen it, you're doing yourself a disservice. Totally check it out, especially if you love The Patriot. Like, The Patriot borrowed a lot from this film, and that film came out 1 or 2 years before I saw this in elementary and history class. And yeah, I love this film. We went over it because they were going over the Civil War, and we watched this whole film, and I absolutely loved it at a young age. Another film that was historical that I saw at a young age in elementary, in music class actually, was The Sound of Music, starring Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer. This was one film where I saw the clips too with that famous hill scene, and I was just like, is this a musical? I don't like musicals. I wasn't accustomed to musicals then, but it was a historical element with Austria being occupied by the Nazis. That is what changed my perception of this movie, where I realized, okay, any perception you have about it being a boring old musical, throw that out the window once the bigger plot comes into play with the Nazi party and them having to escape. That is where the movie really thrives, and this is such an underrated film, iconic film that everybody, especially during these turbulent times, needs to see right now. Next up in 1966 is Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is the final film of the Dollars trilogy, or Man with No Name trilogy. Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef. This and Once Upon a Time in the West are just iconic westerns, spaghetti westerns that just redefine the genre. Clint Eastwood is perfect. He was born to play the man with no name. After Rawhide, going to films and playing this character with a poncho, little cigarette, the hat, everything is just so iconic in the Western genre with the iconography. Hearing Ecstasy of Gold by Ennio Morricone is just amazing. And yeah, I love it. The bridge explosion scene. You wouldn't have some of the stuff you see in the Red Dead Redemption video games without this film. It is that iconic. The whole trilogy, really, but this one is the end-all, be-all for the trilogy. You can see Once Upon a Time Mexico, John Wick 4, so many other action films in later decades were inspired by The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. After that, in 1967, is another Paul Newman classic, Cool Hand Luke. Yeah, he can eat all the eggs. This is based on a novel, but it involves a Southern man who is sentenced to 2 years in this prison, but he refuses to conform. He plays Lucas Jackson, aka Luke. We also have George Kennedy as Dragline. You may recognize George Kennedy with Leslie Nielsen in the Naked Gun films. Man, I absolutely love this. So many iconic moments. Yeah, Paul Newman is just the epitome of cool. You don't have to go around saying you're cool. You just are. And that's what Paul Newman is the epitome of cool in this film and so many other films like The Sting, Butch Cassidy, Hustler, Color and Money, you name it. Any gridiron prison movies you see owe a lot to this film, the way it shows the prison life, the way it shows Luke refusing to conform, the brutality from the fellow officers that are over him. Such a crazy movie, and even a darker novel, I would say. This is such a classic. If you have never seen Cool Hand Luke, you're missing out. Do yourself a favor if you're a cinephile and check out Cool Hand Luke. After that, at 1968, is Once Upon a Time in the West. This is Sergio Leone's magnum opus. I love this. This and Good and the Bad and the Ugly are the most epic westerns, and both from the same decade. This is really the birth of the railroad, the birth of America, modern day America in a way. You get Henry Fonda in his one time as a villain playing the Men in Black Frank. You get Charles Bronson as a harmonica kid, Jason Robards as Cheyenne, Claudia Cardinale as Jill. This is just an awesome movie. And again, Ennio Morricone's score is iconic. This is a long, slow burn of a film, but it's worth it seeing how all the characters and stories culminate in the third act. And this is just a masterpiece at its finest. Probably the best Western ever made, in my opinion. This movie just rocks. And it's a brutal Western, even for this period. You start to see, going through this list and many other films of the 60s, you start to see what happens and how they reflect the world around them with everything going on with civil rights, the Vietnam War, counterculture movements, assassinations. You get to see how the films become a bit darker and edgier, even with Easy Rider in the late 60s. But this movie, I just recently got the 4K. Man, this is what theaters and CinemaScope and widescreen were made for, were films like this. And it's an influential film that has inspired so many filmmakers and films. Even like Sharon Stone and Quick and the Dead by Sam Raimi borrowed elements from this movie's plot. Oh man, this is just a fine spaghetti western. And it's one of the best, if not the best. Finally, with 1969, we have another Bond film, an underrated one at that, with On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I wasn't sure what to think about this. I saw George Lazenby and I'm like, this doesn't feel like Connery. Watch the movie. Seriously, if Connery was in this probably would have been his best Bond over Goldfinger. But George Lazenby adds such a humanity and groundedness that you wouldn't see until Dalton and Craig decades later. This is such an iconic film, from the opening of just revealing his aviator glasses, him saving some woman, and she runs off and he's like, this never happened to the other fellow, breaking the fourth wall there. You have Kojak, Terry Savalas, play Blofeld, and who could forget the late, great Diane Rigg, playing the love interest slash wife of James Bond at the end, Tracy. She's the daughter of a mob boss, and yeah, this is kind of crazy because like it's a little psychedelic. You can see a little bit of Austin Powers taking influence from this, but it's like, it's not the 70s aesthetic, but it's not entirely the 60s from the Connery. It's like this weird in between of the 60s and 70s, with the wardrobe and everything. But I love the romance here. I love the fights. Oh man, the whole ski resort, like that whole assault in the snow towards the end of the film is just great. I mean, the middle chase portion of this you see later in For Your Eyes Only, but also Inception from Christopher Nolan was heavily inspired by this film. The opening recapping the previous films at dun, 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 dun. And then who could forget that tragic end? We have all the time in the world. So much of this was kind of put onto No Time to Die, but this is such a tragic ending. As much as I love Connery kicking ass and taking names and Diamonds Are Forever, I would have loved to see how they would have explored Bond's grief with George Lazenby. But you know what? He was in one film, and he made it a memorable one at that. And a fine way to end Bond in the 60s. Anyway, that does it for my favorite films from every year of the 1960s. Feel free to share your favorites down in the comments below. In the meantime, you can check out these other videos for more content. Let me know if you want to see 50s, 70s, 80s, and onward down in the comments below. Be safe and healthy, everyone. Look out for each other and be kind. Till next time.